The courtroom fell dead silent. The judge, firm and confident, delivered a fine to the woman standing before him, dismissive of her calm but assertive demeanor. What he didn't know? She wasn't just another defendant. She was a high-ranking federal prosecutor. And this courtroom was about to turn into a career-defining disaster for him. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning rhythm, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of defendants waiting their turn, the gavel striking to command order. It was just another day in municipal court. A line of people, most with minor traffic violations or municipal citations, stood quietly awaiting judgment. No one expected anything remarkable to happen. She walked in alone, confident but not loud, dressed in a conservative gray blazer and slacks, no flashy jewelry, hair neatly pulled back. She took her seat near the back, silent and composed, her eyes scanning the room, not nervously, but with the alertness of someone used to reading people. She didn't pull out her phone, didn't fidget. She just waited. When her name was finally called, Ms. Renee Baldwin, she stood up and walked to the front without hesitation. The judge, an older white man in his late 60s with thinning gray hair and a history of running his courtroom with a strict, no-nonsense attitude, didn't even glance up at her at first. He was skimming through her file, already assuming what the next few minutes would look like. Another minor violation, another quick judgment. "You're here for a traffic violation," he said, his tone clipped. "Failure to stop completely at a red light before turning. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" She didn't rush. "I'd like to briefly explain." He cut her off, eyes finally lifting to meet hers. "This is not a trial. You can either plead guilty, not guilty, or no contest. Explanations aren't necessary at this stage." She paused. Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. "No contest," she replied calmly. He smirked slightly, as if expecting something else. "Very well. Maximum fine, $500. Due within 14 days. A whisper passed through the courtroom, subtle but audible. Most traffic fines for that violation in this city range from $100 to $250. The maximum was rarely issued unless there were aggravating circumstances. There were none in her case. No accidents, no injuries, just a routine stop. Her eyes didn't flinch. She nodded. Understood. She turned to leave, her heels clicking softly on the worn floor tiles. No anger in her walk, no visible signs of frustration, just composure. But as she stepped away, the judge stared after her, something about her striking a faint chord of familiarity. Still, he said nothing. She took her seat near the door, waiting as the rest of the docket moved forward. The courtroom clerk, a younger woman with bright eyes and a sharper memory than her employer, glanced at the file and leaned toward the judge. "You do know who that is, right?" she whispered. He shook his head slightly, irritated. "Should I?" The clerk hesitated. "That's Assistant U.S. Attorney Renee Baldwin. She's prosecuting the Taylor financial fraud case, the one that made national news last month." The judge stiffened. He looked back at the docket, rereading the name. His mouth twitched. His eyes flicked toward the woman in the back, now calmly observing, a faint smile at the corners of her mouth. He tried to mask his reaction, but the moment had already slipped. The courtroom felt different now. A few attorneys in the room had already made the connection. Some were texting. One even quietly stepped out to make a call. The tension rippled like a wave in water, small but undeniable. Renee remained seated, unmoved by the growing awareness. She wasn't here to flex her authority. She hadn't introduced herself as anyone important, hadn't asked for a favor, hadn't thrown her title around. She let him treat her like just another defendant, and he had. Only now did he realize the enormity of his mistake, not just because of who she was, but because of what it revealed about how quickly he had judged her. No questions asked, no interest in hearing more, just a fast decision based on surface-level information and assumptions. The judge tried to refocus. He finished the next few cases quickly, but his voice had lost its usual edge. He seemed distracted, unfocused, and more than a little unsettled. Occasionally, his eyes flicked back toward Renee, as if hoping she'd say something to break the silence, or fearing that she would. She never did. She sat quietly until the docket ended. Then, just as the judge was about to dismiss the court, she stood and approached the bench once more. She waited until she was acknowledged. "Your Honor," she said, her voice low but strong. "I just wanted to thank you for your time today." There was a moment of silence. Too long. The kind of silence that humbles. He nodded, barely audible. "You're welcome." And with that, she turned and left. No drama, no confrontation. Just a quiet departure that somehow echoed louder than any outburst ever could. Outside the courtroom, the whispers grew louder. Legal assistants, junior attorneys, and clerks were already recounting what they'd seen. A few had recorded parts of the session. Others were already drafting emails. And back inside, the judge remained in his seat for longer than usual, staring down at the docket sheet, haunted by a name that now meant something entirely different. The fine had been issued. The judgment had been passed. But the real trial, the one about bias, power, and assumptions, had only just begun. The courtroom had returned to its rhythm. Papers shuffled, voices murmured, and cases continued. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. The moment Renee Baldwin walked away from the judge's bench, the dynamic in the room tilted. Those who noticed began whispering. Those who didn't soon followed suit. The judge, now visibly unsettled, kept glancing toward the back of the courtroom, where she had quietly resumed her seat. He tried to carry on, but his voice betrayed him. The firmness that had once commanded the room now faltered, tinged with unease. His gavel strikes were less confident. He stumbled over names. He missed a sentencing detail and had to be corrected by his clerk. Something was undeniably off. He couldn't shake it. The name, the face, the eerie feeling that he had made a grave error. Then the whisper from his clerk finally echoed in his mind again. Renee Baldwin, the same federal prosecutor making headlines across the state. The same one involved in indicting several prominent officials on corruption charges. The same woman he'd just fined without a second thought. His eyes darted toward her file again. Her full name, her address, her occupation field, left blank, just like many others who didn't feel the need to fill out every line. But now it all clicked. She hadn't corrected him. She hadn't reminded him of who she was. She hadn't pulled rank, even though she could have. She let the scene unfold. Let him reveal his hand, not with rage, but with calm detachment. Renee remained seated, posture still. There was no smugness in her demeanor, just an air of quiet authority. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She didn't need one. The point had been made the moment he realized who she truly was, and how little effort he had made to understand her when it mattered. The next case ended, and court recessed for a short break. The judge retreated into his chambers, but not before throwing one last glance toward her. A glance that looked more like a question. "Are you going to do something with this?" In the hallway outside, several people lingered, not to chat about their cases, but to talk about what they'd just witnessed. Some had recognized her immediately, her face familiar from news coverage. Others only now made the connection through whispered conversations and social media searches. A junior defense attorney stood beside another, wide-eyed. "That was her, Baldwin. I didn't recognize her in person." "Yep," the other one said. "That's her, the one taking down half the city council. And he just fined her like she was a parking offender." Meanwhile, inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was thick. He sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the docket again, as if hoping to rewrite the morning with his eyes. He muttered under his breath, then asked his clerk for confirmation. She nodded. "Do you think she's going to report this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The clerk didn't answer. She didn't have to. Whether she filed a formal complaint or not was almost beside the point. The damage was already done. The courtroom wasn't a vacuum. People had watched. People had recorded. And most of all, people were talking. Back in the hallway, Renee stepped outside. She took a breath, letting the sunlight hit her face, her jaw slightly clenched. A colleague who had quietly observed the entire proceeding approached her. "You handled that with more restraint than I could have mustered," he said. She gave a small smile. "I've learned it's more effective to let people reveal who they are." He made his judgment before I said a single word. He nodded slowly. "Are you going to make a statement?" "Why would I need to?" she replied. "He made it for me." Inside, the judge tried to draft a memo to explain his handling of the case, already anticipating blowback. He fumbled with his words, torn between defending procedure and preemptively addressing the inevitable headlines. He knew what it would look like, a white judge handing down the maximum fine to a black woman, without listening, without looking, only to realize she held more power than he did. As he wrote, news notifications began pinging his phone. Local legal blogs had picked up the story. One headline read, "Federal Prosecutor fined in local court. Judge left red-faced after identity reveal." The comments were brutal. Screenshots from the public court camera were being dissected. A short video clip had even surfaced. Though the courtroom wasn't usually live-streamed, someone in attendance had discreetly recorded the moment of realization. The judge's sudden shift, the whispered exchange, the ripple effect. Renee's name was trending within hours, not because she demanded justice, but because she quietly exposed what blind assumptions can do in a courtroom meant to uphold fairness. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't threaten, retaliate, or complain. The facts spoke for themselves. Her silence became the loudest statement of all. The judge, once confident and authoritative, now found himself at the mercy of public opinion and under the quiet, piercing gaze of a woman who knew the law better than he ever expected. Within 24 hours, the courtroom incident had reached every corner of the legal community. What began as a routine appearance for a traffic violation had unraveled into a stark and public lesson in perception, power, and quiet accountability. The story spread like wildfire, not because of an outburst or dramatic confrontation, but because of what wasn't said, what wasn't done, and how clearly that silence revealed everything. Legal blogs were the first to pick it up, writing pieces that hinted at deeper implications. Local news stations followed, running segments titled "Judge Embarrassed After Mistaking Prosecutor for Defendant." And then the national headlines came. It was no longer just about a fine. It was about a moment, a courtroom decision made without curiosity, without care, and without recognizing the person in front of the bench. Calls for an investigation weren't immediate, but murmurs started building. Civil rights groups began demanding answers. Attorneys started anonymously submitting experiences about similar behavior in that courtroom. Not all of it was malicious, but the patterns were clear: disrespect, dismissiveness, and a lack of impartiality that seemed to target people of color, especially women. Still, Renee Baldwin remained publicly silent. She declined interviews. She didn't post anything on social media. She didn't issue a statement or file a formal complaint. Her silence was not weakness, it was power. A deliberate act of restraint that made the public and the legal world lean in even closer. The judge, meanwhile, was drowning in the fallout. He had served for decades without challenge. His court had always been his domain. His tone set the pace, his word final. But now, every past decision was being re-examined under a new lens. Colleagues began to distance themselves. Some offered quiet sympathy. Others stayed away, fearing association with a man now viewed as a symbol of the justice system's deeper flaws. At the courthouse, things changed quickly. Whispered stories among lawyers turned into conversations in official meetings. Minorities in the legal field, Black women especially, began recounting similar experiences, moments where they were spoken over, doubted, or outright dismissed. Renee's moment wasn't an isolated event. It was a mirror, and behind closed doors, the judge's own world was shrinking. Media scrutiny grew. Pressure mounted. He released a short statement days later, dry, procedural, filled with legal language and an awkward nod to the importance of professionalism and respect. It only fueled the fire. He still hadn't named her. That's what struck people the most. Even after the backlash, even after realizing who she was and how wrong he had been, he refused to publicly acknowledge her name. It wasn't just about embarrassment, it was ego, pride, a refusal to admit that in a moment of arrogance, he had reduced a highly respected federal prosecutor to just another face in the crowd. But Renee didn't need him to say it. Inside the Department of Justice, her reputation grew. Quietly, yes, but significantly. Colleagues took note of her poise. Supervisors respected her choice not to weaponize the moment. Instead, she continued her work, leading investigations, managing federal cases, and appearing in courtrooms where her presence now carried a sharper edge. Defense attorneys treated her differently, not out of fear, but respect. Judges paid more attention. Bailiffs stood straighter. In every courtroom she entered after that day, the air shifted. She wasn't just Renee Baldwin anymore. She was the woman who had turned a judge's gavel into his own confession. Publicly, she remained composed. Privately, she received hundreds of messages, some praising her, others sharing their own stories. Many were from young Black law students who saw in her an example of strength they had never seen so clearly. Not the kind of strength that shouts or threatens, but the kind that waits and lets the truth speak for itself. Meanwhile, the judge's position was officially reviewed. While no misconduct charges were immediately filed, his docket was reassigned. A committee quietly began to look into past cases. The courthouse held mandatory bias training for all court officers. None of these things could erase what had happened, but it was a start. And through it all, Renee kept moving forward. She didn't build her career on moments of exposure. She built it on excellence, on integrity, on knowing that her work, her name, and her silence were enough to expose something louder than outrage ever could. The courtroom had never been equal ground. Not for everyone. But that day, something shifted. A reminder that assumptions carry weight. And the consequences of those assumptions, especially when wielded by those in power, can ripple far beyond one moment, one person, one fine. The judge thought he was ending a case with a gavel and a number. He didn't realize he was beginning a reckoning.